The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman from Org Vitality. Welcome to the webinar on Lifecycle Surveys. We're a few minutes away from starting. Thank you for your patience. And, you're in the right place, right time. We'll be starting as soon as we can. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on Lifecycle Surveys. We are just a minute or two away from starting the webinar. You should be seeing a title screen on your screen now, and hopefully you're hearing my voice. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Thanks very much for your patience. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on Lifecycle Surveys. We are just at the time. I'm going to give it one more minute because I can see a lot of people who are signing on but are not yet in the room. So let's just give them 1 minute to finish their sign-on process, and we'll be starting the webinar shortly. At this point, you should be seeing a title screen for the webinar called Lifecycle Surveys, and hopefully you're hearing my voice. We'll be starting in just a moment. Thank you for your patience. Okay, everybody, welcome to the webinar on Lifecycle Surveys. My name is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality, and I'll be the host of the webinar today, along with two other presenters who I'll be introducing in just a minute. The title of this webinar is Lifecycle Surveys, Current Trends and a Look Ahead. Well, life cycle surveys, or you could also call it life cycle data collection, if you will, it's coming into vogue, if not focus. The interest level on life cycle surveys in the last year and a half has grown pretty tremendously. It's that shiny new thing in the water that people are reaching for, or it's a topic that is getting enough visibility that many companies are afraid of being left behind if their competitors are doing this kind of thing and accessing business intelligence information that they don't have access to. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of rapidly increasing interest in life cycle surveys. But I have to say that life cycle surveys have been around for a very long time. They're really nothing new, right? But they were very painful to execute. They were difficult to draw conclusions on. They were almost impossible to look across all the various components and come to clear behavioral or actions that an organization should take about them. So what's changed? What's different now? Why is it the level of interest growing so rapidly? Well, one thing that's changed is there's a lot of new technology that's coming online these days, and that technology has really enabled a more comprehensive look across the entire employee life cycle, tracking employees from their very earliest days in the organization, or even before they get into the organization, through exiting the organization in some fashion or another. Sometimes these life cycle surveys have been inhibited by structure, whereas it's not always the same part of the organization that owns the various components of life cycle surveys. And so there has also been some accommodation, or there's been some restructuring that allows for the data to be more easily gathered and shared. And of course, terms like big data and AI are terms that are commonly thrown around, and that is having an impact on the ability to draw insights into life cycle surveys that needs to be examined as well. But one of the topics that's less often touched on, but also very important, is this privacy issues. If you're tracking someone from the very early days of even when they're thinking of joining an organization to when they join, when they socialize, their annual surveys, to when they're exiting, and you're beginning to look at the employee holistically, there's privacy issues that are sometimes discussed, but not all that often. But that privacy issue is going to have to take center stage before this whole notion of life cycle surveys really fully matures. So let me introduce our presenters today, and let me do a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in and really talk about where are we in terms of life cycle surveys, where's the industry, what are some various companies doing on life cycle surveys. There'll be three of us participating in the presentation today, in the webinar today. As I mentioned, I'm Jeff Saltzman. I'm the one all the way on the left. Oh, there we go. I'm Jeff Saltzman, the one all the way on the left. I'm the young-looking one on the screen. We also have two of my partners from OV, Scott Brooks and Victoria Hendrickson will be joining me in this presentation. And I have to say that it's always a real pleasure working with these two in terms of whatever topic we have to be presenting on. I often learn much more than I contribute as I speak with both Scott and Victoria in terms of the topic that we are working on. And the three of us, just to mention, we have an upcoming chapter in a book on conducting surveys called the Survey Handbook. It's coming out by Oxford University Press sometime next year. So that's who will be presenting. So a couple other housekeeping questions. We're going to try and leave some time at the end for questions. And if you go to the box where it says questions on your screen and type in any questions you may have, we'll be monitoring that box. And at the end, hopefully we'll have 5-10 minutes to answer as many as we can. If we don't get to your questions and you'd like to discuss them with us later, we'd be happy to do that with you. So now let's explore life cycle surveys. Let me put on my senior HR hat, maybe my senior HR voice, and say, hey, Director of Survey Research, we need to do life cycle surveys.
And as that Director of Survey Research, I think that's a great idea. What triggered the interest? Why are we on this journey?
Well, you know, employee engagement is just no longer good enough. We need to track the employee experience.
And that sounds like a great idea. Certainly something we're hearing a lot about. But by the way, we want to say what else is out there. So what are some of the main organizational challenges we want to wrap up in this?
You know the usual: competing for top technical talent, or scaling systems and knowledge in bigger groups and doing more complex work, maybe keeping high potentials engaged and retained.
And that sounds like a lot, more than just the employee experience. So we certainly want to talk about life cycles, but let's start by looking at the census survey and seeing what we can get there.
Yeah, so here's an example of what you can learn from just a census survey about life cycle kinds of information. And it's always a great place to start. So pretend you're in an organization, you got a background that says we've got a headcount that's supposed to grow pretty dramatically within a couple of years. And so our main goal is bringing new employees up to speed. That's the setting. So in your census survey, you might have an item that kind of looks like this one, which is, you know, new employees get the training they need. And so what do people do when they see that item? Well, the first thing is you slice out the newbies. And so, of course, you look at that. You might find that about half of everybody feels like they get the training they need, maybe more. But you can dig a little deeper under this and get even better information when you slice it by everybody else. So one thing that a census survey does is it's not just information from newbies, but you can get information about the newbies coming up to speed from everybody else. And this is a fairly typical pattern, even if the parts of the green bar are a little different. But what this pattern says is that newbies kind of think things might be going okay, but it's everybody else who has to clean up their messes and take time off of their jobs to help the newbies really come up to speed. It's the other people who are a little bit more diagnostic. And so this begins to set up a point that's one of our meta themes through here, which is that the best source of information might not be just looking at those that you'd expect. So information about new employees might not only come from newbies. So hold that thought. I want to give another quick example about how census surveys can help with life cycle style statements with a retention risk example. So many of you might have in your surveys something about, I'm not considering leaving in the next 12 months. And you might find scores something like this, you know, a 10% unfavorable, which would be your retention risk factor, might be fairly typical. That tells you what your overall risk is. But of course, one of the things you can do is dig into pockets of risk and find that from that overall, there might be other divisions or pockets or segments of employees that have different kinds of higher risk. Now that tells you where to go and where to focus. It doesn't necessarily tell you what to do. But if all you have is a census survey, of course, you can run drivers of intention to stay and figure out what are the other topics most related to that outcome. And you might find things that look like this. I want to emphasize this is example information from sort of adapted from a couple of different clients, but career goals, sense of leadership, maybe a manager who can eliminate barriers, and something about workload or planning and so forth. That's fairly typical. Now, all this does, this does a great job of getting you started, and you can find then life cycle statements and information, even if you're not doing life cycle surveys.
So, you know, we say the census can tell us some of these questions. It can start to address a lot of these points that Scott's bringing up about how people come up to scale and where you might be at risk for turnover.
But one thing it can't do, it's not about actual retention or other business metrics, other parts of the employee experience.
And that's where we start to look beyond the census and say, let's not look at each individual survey, but a holistic life cycle survey program to give us a better picture of how employees move throughout the organization.
Okay, I'll bite. Tell me more, Victoria.
All righty. Well,
Victoria.
yeah, that's right. So what are life cycle surveys? Simply put, they're surveys at multiple touch points in an employee's tenure or sort of progress through an organization. And they typically focus on how employees enter, work within, exit an organization. And it really sets up, this is another one of our meta themes here, the opportunity for the integration of multiple data sources. And really what we're driving towards is holistic insight that gives some forward-looking predictions. And this gives you a view of the system, not just individual points in time. And if you think about your job here, is not to trace each individual and how they feel and think through their own life cycle, but in a better way, your job is to manage the flow that's ongoing all the time of employees through different stages within your organization. So let's get a little bit more specific. There are many possible touch points to do life cycle surveys, and you can see here we've got some pre-hire, offer, accept or reject, onboarding, assimilation, the census survey certainly in the middle there. Exit, boomerang, that's people who might come back to your organization, retirement and so forth. Now, there's more listed here than typically you want, and there's certainly others that aren't even on this list. But what you really want to focus on is the questions that they answer. So you think about the questions that are important to you and managing your own employee base. You know, whom do you attract? What's the candidate experience? Are they likely to accept an offer, right? Early on, what are your challenges? And it's certainly different in retail with 100% or more turnover versus maybe heavy manufacturing. You want to ask too, you know, how do these new employees come up to speed? What's the ongoing experience and what do employees see in the business, with your goal here of using employee intelligence to help manage success and drive towards higher performance. And then with the resignation, why do people resign? Why are they likely to return? Are they ready to retire? And how do you evaluate your potential talent loss? So all of these come together, and really want to emphasize that the questions that you're trying to answer are more important than the surveys themselves.
Yep. So we've got a little more information about the different kinds of surveys and questions people are asking of their organizations. Over the last year or so, we've been conducting an industry study to learn more about what kinds of life cycle surveys are used, what people are looking for moving forward. And we're going to have a couple of stats from that study sprinkled throughout here. There will be a link to the whole set of results in the slides we send out after. So don't worry about writing down each percentage and mapping it up with what you do. We'll certainly get all that detailed information out to you. But we want to focus on a couple things here. We want to look at what people use, and that's going to be here in the blue. So this is the percentage of companies we surveyed that use each of these touch points. And we're also going to look at the satisfaction of impact of each of those surveys. So for people who use each of these survey types in yellow, you'll see, how much they're satisfied with the impact of those. And just on this slide here, you'll see companies vary a bit with which touch points they use, and that makes sense. So depending on the company's strategy and the kind of workforce they have, different kinds of these touch points will be more informative and give the kinds of insight they need to drive action. That said, there are three that really stand out here, and that's the onboarding, exit, and census opinion surveys. They're certainly the most popular. They're also the surveys with the most satisfaction on impact. So these are the ones that have more common practices. There's more to share and learn from. And so overall, these kinds of touch points have become more sophisticated. And since they are the most popular ones, we're going to use these to illustrate some examples of a life cycle approach throughout the rest of this webinar. So if we go ahead and start with the exit surveys, we see these are the most heavily used. So 93% of companies that we surveyed use some kind of exit survey, but we see only 35% of organizations that use them feel that they're really satisfied with the way that they have an impact. So we'll see what that looks like in practice here.
So, I'm really not happy with our exit survey process. It's really important, and I'm just not happy with the way things are going. Turnover is increasing in key job categories. Scott, what can you do about this?
So we're going to frame up those questions. There are different ways that we think about turnover and different ways to frame it up.
So what is the typical frame for an exit survey? It's a natural question to ask, right? Why are you leaving? And so you think about an exit survey as being able to address that question. But if we were to think about a slightly more refined question, what you really want to know is not why is any one individual leaving, usually. You want to have a little bit more of an expansive frame and say, what could have been done months ahead of time to prevent regrettable quits? And so with this frame, we can start thinking a little differently about what an exit survey is and how it fits into the bigger program of life cycle surveys for you. So let me just do a little grounding here. Think about quitting. What is a decision to leave? Typically, it's a combination of three forces, right? So some version of maybe I don't like it here, right? That's the push. That's dissatisfaction. There's a pull to another alternative. I just got a call by a headhunter, or maybe I'm going back to school for a degree of some sort, or I'm pregnant with twins and I have a different alternative that's non-work altogether. But usually there's something else that I am moving towards. And then the last force, which sometimes people don't think of as a force technically, but it is, ask a physicist, it's friction. How hard is it for you to make a move, make a switch? Do you have to change geographically? Are you going to lose vesting in a 401k or anything else? So if you think about these three forces, how can you build a life cycle survey program to help that? First, the employee survey can really help with the push, even months ahead of actual termination, right? You can figure out later on, you can attach who actually quit to an employee survey, and you can figure out what separates the folks who quit from those who left. And that really is a good match to the question of months ahead of time, how could you have known who would have quit, right? And what are the best predictors of future quitting? Now, exit surveys can touch a little bit on that, and I'll give you a little bit more specifics in a minute, but they're really good for documenting the pull. What is the decision process that you went through in order to conclude that that you're going to terminate with an organization? And then as you stir all this together, it's analysis and actual termination data that can statistically document what are the most important factors. So all this is fairly conceptual. Let me ground it with some more concrete, quick tips. And what would it mean to talk about decision process in an exit survey and so forth? So first of all, exit surveys are most commonly owned by HR. They are the focus for reporting and action. There are occasions where line managers might get reports and so forth, but most commonly it's an HR-owned process. Some of the typical mechanics of an exit survey, all employees who terminate are invited, and often you send out invitations as fast as your system can manage. Sometimes people feel like they should sweat and wonder about some theoretical or ideal clean timing, but usually all of that is surpassed by and subordinate to just doing what you can to get the right people to take the surveys at the right time. And once you've got some data, there can be some useful reporting. There's segmentation that's really important by the more regrettable terminations. Those that are voluntary, come from strategic positions, high performers, high potentials, and so forth. It's really important to compare these to each other. You don't just want to know what high performers think about when they're quitting. You want to know what makes them different from non-high performers. And in a similar way, you really need in your exit survey some scaled items, maybe some drivers of retention for matching to your census survey, so you can compare at the time of quitting, what are people thinking about various topics versus what they thought when they last took the census survey, or versus what their cohorts are thinking who are not departing the organization, right? So comparisons are really important on these kinds of things. But when I said that you want to ask about the decision process in an exit survey, here's some kinds of things that only an exit survey can get into, and a census survey really doesn't. So like if a couple of issues were resolved, would you have continued to work here? Would you work for the organization again if you could? Was it hard to leave? Did you actively look for another job? A new job was or will be easy to find? What kind of job are you moving into, including are you staying with the same industry, or something about exactly what company are you working for? I did a project a while back where initially people were moving into different industries, but over time for this one particular job category, they started to move into competitor jobs. And that was just a piece of the whole story that really said that things were changing. So this helps set up some quick reviews of what exit surveys are and some of the questions you ask and their role in the process. What we'd like to do is to move pretty snappily into the next category that Victoria set up, the onboarding surveys. So this is the third most common type of life cycle survey that people use, and there's moderate satisfaction. You know, people really see opportunities for improvement. So with that, let's dive in.
So one of the things we need from an onboarding survey is really knowing, you know, are the new folks getting connected to the right people, the right knowledge? Are they getting up to speed quickly enough to be effective and a real contributor to the organization?
So let's frame up those questions too.
So often when we talk to clients about onboarding surveys, the typical frame is, do new employees have what they need to get started? Is their computer set up? Do they know who to talk to? Essentially, do they have the basics? And that's important. We can talk about other things, but those are kind of the base requirements to get started. We can't do a lot without that. But we do want to think about a more refined frame, or perhaps thinking of it as more of an organizational frame. So beyond thinking about each individual employee and perhaps the resources they need to get started, if we think more broadly about what can be done to help employees come up to speed at scale. In the case Scott shared earlier, you know, we're talking about an organization that's planning to have headcount grow really rapidly to meet some complex organizational needs. We want to make sure that the system is ready to help people en masse get up to speed and do well quickly. So we want to think about how we can essentially answer both of those questions from an onboarding survey. So to do that, we want to think about the onboarding survey with a couple of factors here. When we think about onboarding, there's of course the frame of the individual and what their needs are immediately, but there's also that organizational need of getting people up to speed at scale. So while each of you aren't managing the onboarding of individual employees, some of those needs are required to get key groups up to speed in order to enable that kind of growth. So if we want to start with individual needs, we might think of that as logistics. These are the really tactical things about getting people set up, making sure they feel welcome, and these kinds of things can be asked really directly on the survey. This is often the beginning of onboarding survey programs. So this is the, do you have what you need? Did you get things set up? And if not, what do you need so that we can help those employees get connected really quickly? Past that, we want to start to think about expectations. And for this, I want to use the example of research on realistic job previews. A lot of you on the phone are probably familiar with that. One of the main findings is that where employees have a clear preview of the job, including less desirable aspects, there tends to be a better retention rate. You might get less applicants through the process, but those that make it tend to be more likely to stay than those who only got a picture of the highlights of what the job is going to be like. And the point here isn't about undesirable aspects of a job, but making sure expectations are clear early on so employees know what they're in for and can prepare. So this is the connecting point of the individual and organizational level of onboarding. We want to make sure new employees are aligned on how their purpose fits in, what their manager is expecting on their performance in the first 30, 60, 90 days, and how they fit into the overall strategic direction of the company. And then past that, we want to start thinking more broadly about the organization and how that employee is able to reach out throughout. And that's the connections piece. So a key piece in our research of how employees get up to speed is whether they know where to go to for answers. And so that has to do with connections within the teams they work within and across teams they may be a part of or may work on different projects with. It's important for initial questions when they're new, but it's really critical to work cross-functionally, transfer knowledge as other people move around, and overall to get a sense of the culture and start getting things done and essentially become not the new employee anymore, to just become a part of the organization quickly. So, with all that said, we want to step back for some quick tips if you were to integrate this kind of approach to an onboarding survey. And we want to start with the overall typical frame of an onboarding survey. It's a little different than maybe some traditional kinds of surveys you run. It's aimed at a very specific population, and the content tends to be owned by a particular group, often a group that runs onboarding or new employee kinds of systems. So generally what we're looking at is all new employees are getting surveys within a specified time of joining the company. Some people do it in the first 30 days, some in the first 60 days. Essentially pick the right time that tends to get people and stick with it. Surveys like this tend to be run by a centralized group who are responsible for understanding this specific kind of data and using it to make changes to improve the overall onboarding experience. And if we look at the planning, what do we want to do with these new employees? A couple key points. We want to get to new employees quickly. I mentioned 30 days, 60 days tend to be common. We really don't want to go too far past that. The first reason for that is data related. We want to get initial opinions quickly. We want to be able to get that initial look before things have changed. The second reason, which may be more important, is more symbolic. Early on, we want to show employees we're listening. So if that's planning as far as timing, the second part might be more on the content end. So on the content end, we want to balance the employee-centric or perhaps individual level of experience with organizational scale kinds of priorities, the kinds of things we were looking at on the last slide with those 3 pieces of onboarding. Often we want to share those key drivers of getting up to speed. So we might find those on our census survey or on other performance analytics we do. We've got some examples here. Whatever those tend to be in your organization, we want to include those on the onboarding survey so that we can identify any groups that might be at risk. If it's really important for people to know their peers in other geographic locations, let's see quickly if people are getting that opportunity early on, or if you need to intervene in order to make sure they're getting those experiences early on. And then finally, if we think about how to make this actionable, we want to think about what we do with these results. Again, it's a little different than a survey where each manager is going to get their own data and drive a conversation with their team. This tends to be more central. So if this is run by a programmatic kind of group, they want to look across the organization to see how onboarding as a system is working. Perhaps they want to share individual findings with managers that have high growth pockets. But really, we're looking at how do you make changes to the system overall. And one of the ways we do that is through linkage research. So if we want to connect some of these onboarding survey opinions and experiences to early performance metrics, opinions in other kinds of surveys we're doing, even things like turnover, that's going to give us a sense of which early experiences and resources help people get up to speed and do well and thrive, so that we can go ahead and work that into future measurements or even interventions for other kinds of new employees.
So we've been walking through the exit and the onboarding. It's time to return now to the census survey, which is pretty clearly the most common kind of life cycle sort of survey people use, and people are most satisfied with it. So as we get into this, Jeff, I got a question for you. We've talked about your needs for census and also or exit and onboarding surveys. For folks at large, what are you thinking about the entire employee base?
Well, I'd like to know, how do we really leverage their expertise to work more effectively?
Yep, these are great questions. And the typical frame we tend to hear on the census opinion kinds of surveys are satisfaction based. So are you satisfied with your experience? Other ways to label this might be engagement, job satisfaction, employee experience. Overall, the question being, how do people like it at work? Are things going well? And don't want to take away from that. You know, that's certainly an important place to start, but we can go further than that and look at a more refined frame and say, not just are individual employees happy in their own job, but what can they tell us in order to help drive business performance? What can they tell us about our business that can help us drive action to be more effective as a whole?
Yeah. So one of the things we want to do with it is give you a couple of examples of what can you do with a census survey if you actually connect it to turnover statistics? What might that look like, and what kinds of things might you do? And so we'll start with a managing turnover with surveys executive level case. So this is from a few years back. It was people who were executive level in a particularly large organization, and there were some results from a survey item on seriously considering leaving the organization. Now, we were able to connect this, and the survey happened in April, to anybody who subsequently quit throughout the entire rest of the year. And so we were able to break that question down by people who stayed through the whole rest of the year, who were 73% favorable and 9% unfavorable. So 9%, almost 1 out of 10 thought they were going to quit, but did not in the rest of the year. And of people who actually did quit in the subsequent several months, at that time of the survey in April, fewer than half thought they were going to stay. And in fact, more than 1 in 4 thought they were going to quit. So part of the punchline here is that more than a quarter of those who actually did depart told us about that several months prior in the employee survey. That's useful intelligence, right? And so we'll dig into this, but if you ever wonder what a good score is, by the way, on an item like this, you know, your results may vary, but basically 25% intending to quit, that's pretty darn close to the profile of somebody who actually does quit. So just bear that in mind as you interpret your own scores. And one thing true too is that intention to quit is almost always the single best predictor of future termination. I say almost always. Frankly, in almost 30 years of doing this kind of stuff, I've not found one better. I'm sure they exist. We keep trying. It's an important pursuit, but intention to quit or different variants of intending to stay and so forth, that's going to be your single best predictor. Now, as a single predictor, that's powerful, but not super instructive in terms of what to do. So you can dig into this a little bit more. Another example is how to create a retention risk index. And so on the next slide, you'll see that we look at, did some special analysis to figure out what really separates the stayers versus leavers in a particular organization. And we came up with a list of items, right, that were actionable in a fashion and also could tell people what to do in order to potentially improve the odds that someone would stay. And so you can take a set of items like this. It probably feels appropriate for you, probably feels like things that you've seen before. And you can actually, once we identified these items, we went back and looked at, well, what did current employees say? What are their scores? And so these are the percent favorables for each of those items. And you can, of course, compare those scores to the people who eventually subsequently left voluntarily. And no surprise, they're lower. They're not always low. You've got, a 70% favorable confidence in the company, which is terrific. But it's much lower than what the current employees say. And so you can calculate these gaps. Now, we did not happen to go in and search for the biggest gaps and identify the items that corresponded to those biggest gaps, but these were pretty darn close to what the biggest gaps were. So if you don't have your hands on fancy statistical packages, if you were to just go in and do the biggest gaps, you would get pretty close and you would get to a useful place.
Mm-hmm. And so whichever path you take towards something like this, whether it's statistically or looking for something like gaps, what it does is it helps you focus on the most actionable areas to make a difference. Often when you're looking at the survey results, there are high scores, low scores, and figuring out what's the most important thing to work on to address retention can be a big question. Do you work on high, low, changed? Something like this helps you point in on what are the factors that are going to make the biggest difference in, changing people's minds. What made the biggest difference for people who left voluntarily? So it's a bit of a prioritization exercise. We found it to be very useful when leaders just want one, maybe two things to focus on. So that's an analysis, example and piece of advice. We want to step back and look at some general quick tips for the census survey and how to make it a little more life cycle oriented. Again, we want to start with the typical mechanics. This is going to be a little more traditional. A lot of you on the phone are going to be very familiar with these kinds of mechanics and rhythms. Typically, all employees get a survey. They're usually run maybe once a year. That is changing a bit in the industry, but essentially the survey is run at a similar time on a regular cadence to make it a company-wide event in order to, kind of build up the overall action cycle of when the survey comes, everybody's going to respond. And then, although it's run by a centralized group, reporting goes beyond that. Typically, all managers with enough responses are going to get a report so that they can have a discussion with their team about the results, and they can work with their team to drive improvements at a local level in a way that's aligned with any change top leadership might be driving and that centralized groups are supporting. So it's more of a whole company exercise on a regular cadence. And with that in mind, there's more opportunity to focus in a way that, and it gets at the needs of all of your stakeholders, since this is a company-wide event, but also to look at the life cycle in a way that takes in the opinions from different kinds of employees. So we're not just focused on new employees, we're not just focused on those that are leaving, but how do we understand the life cycle based on everyone's opinion and experience? One way to do that is to keep that design with a mix of the strategic and experience focus. So by this point, you'll have different kinds of life cycle nuggets that you might have been thinking about. So whether it's those markers of getting employees up to speed, or whether it's those attrition risk areas that you've looked at, we want to make sure to include each of those pieces on our census survey and the questions we ask of the census survey in analysis phases afterwards. When we start to think about the analysis plan, we'll want to do the typical, what's the lay of the land in the organization, what are highs, lows, what's changing, but we also want to ask specific life cycle questions of the data to say, how are people moving through the company and what would help people move through in a more effective way that they can be successful and the organization continue to grow and scale? And those are different kinds of questions you're asking of the data, and different groups of employees will be able to inform those questions. So one example is the one Scott started with you might ask a question on the survey about how new employees are getting up to speed, but it's the people with higher tenure that can actually tell you how that's happening. So there are different ways to look at that. Some might be looking at your business activity. So instead of just looking at individual departments that are manager-led, looking at product groups that are executing on different cycles together. You might look at cohorts of who's joined and left the organization together, who's moving across the organization as far as numbers of managers or working in matrix teams. Essentially what I'm saying here is you might have to go beyond your traditional EEO types of segments and look at more strategic groups that have to do with how your business gets done in order to get a better sense of what that life cycle is like. And then in order to really make this actionable in a life cycle sense, we want to go beyond the typical reporting and start to look at different kinds of linkage. So we'll want to link opinions on the census survey, not just to other opinions like your exit survey or your onboarding survey, but to specific outcomes. So whether it's performance or customer behavior or actual turnover activity, we're going to be able to create better predictive models if we can see which opinions actually lead to the outcomes we're looking for. So which opinions in your employee survey are predicting customer satisfaction? Is it when your employees tell you customer issues get resolved? Is it whether employees have the resources they need to get things done for their customers? That's going to start to give you a sense of what kinds of things you might prioritize in action planning, and it can also inform your subsequent life cycle efforts. So one client of ours found on their census survey that their high potentials in a specific product group were less happy and at higher risk for attrition. And so they used that finding to say, okay, let's target that group for stay interviews. Let's find out what they really need to be happy here and see a future. So one finding on the census was able to help them target the next step of the life cycle. And so this is really an ongoing journey. Each survey is really just the next step to say, what else do we need to know about that life cycle to make it more effective?
So if we now step back from this and, from any particular kind of life cycle survey, we want to talk about how we can aspire to more. And the first is about connecting the data. And so we've talked about a bunch of the life cycle touch points. And, there's power in individual touch points, but there's more power in connecting the touch points, right? The census survey can tell you much about the whole life cycle. We've talked about that. Other surveys can become important supplements. And it's this integration, however, that's more powerful than any standalone effort. In particular, I think with exit surveys or onboarding surveys, connecting the messages that you get through any one of those touch points to the census survey helps anchor it in something larger. And so as you decide what's important for you, is it bringing people up to speed, or is it managing exits, or something else that with the life cycle questions? You want to focus on your own questions first and go to the technology second. It's easy to go overboard with technological needs and worry about that before you even know what you're really trying to do. If you're in pharmaceuticals versus high tech versus hospitality, your needs for managing the flow of people and knowledge and information is going to be very different. And let alone, how is it going to be different from what your competitors are trying to do versus what you're trying to do? That would be an advanced question. Now, all that said, technology can be really fun. It can be cool. And so let me just give you a quick sampling of how we do it with a life cycle integration. That you can have dashboards that link together full life cycle information from different kinds of projects and different kinds of information to give you quick snippets. But also very fun is the ability to mix and match data. And so in this case, you could create an engagement survey report that would compare those who would later quit for career reasons to those who didn't quit at all. or those who would later quit for some other kind of reason. And that helps give you the kind of information. So technology is fun, but don't get too distracted by it. So let's move on to other ways to aspire to more.
Part of this aspiration I want to acknowledge is that there are challenges. I'm sure if we asked all of you on the phone today who wants to connect all of their life cycle touch points, maybe if you have all of these on the screen, you'd all say you want to. You probably see all kinds of potential of the kinds of insights you can get by integrating these together and looking across. And then if we were to ask, but how many of you are able to, there are a lot of reasons why it might not be possible or why you might not be doing it at the level you'd like to. And that's just because there are so many pieces of complexity in this life cycle approach. Often these touch points are owned by different places in the organization. They're reported on different cycles and different levels of aggregation, which all makes sense in order to make them actionable and have them sit with the subject matter experts. But it makes it hard to have a holistic survey program. So what we've found in our work that there are a couple of considerations to integrating each of these touch points, including some of these pieces on the screen here. Some of you will certainly have more or others. But really the main point is it requires a broader survey strategy and some cross-functional collaboration. If you have each of these surveys in different places, you can't just snap your fingers and say, well, I want to bring them all together. I will have all of your surveys come together under one umbrella. There are certainly considerations, and by setting up a broader survey strategy, you can certainly plan for all of these to come together in a mechanical way better, but also you can ensure that that broad survey strategy encompasses the events an individual goes through, as well as how the system supports the way individuals go through each of those systems. So certainly we want to look forward at being able to bring these together, having the mechanics that follow enable integration. But on the next slide, what we want to look at is what's a foundational piece to start with. If you have onboarding, census, and exit surveys, what are a couple of things you can do to make sure you've covered both of the individual experience, the organizational needs, and start to bring those together? If we start by looking at new employees, on the individual side, it is really important to look at the logistics. So do they have the support they need for getting set up? Do they have the expectations for what's going to be happening in the coming months? And do they know where to go with questions? We want to make sure we've got that covered for our new people coming in and make sure they feel welcome. But on the organizational side, we want to look at the data and say, are key employees getting up to speed quickly? In areas where we know we're going to grow and we know things are important, are we ready for them? Are we ready to get them up to speed? And are we hiring people with the right capabilities across the organization? As the work itself changes, are we bringing in the right people that can help us succeed? When we look at our census survey, that's going to be targeted toward our ongoing employees. Of course, we want to ask about engagement. We want to know that there's gas in the tank and that people are excited to come to work and dive in and that they like the work they're doing day to day. And we want to make sure that they're excited to stay. Do they see a promising future for themselves and are there good career opportunities? But when we step back and look at the whole organization, it's more about performance effectiveness and quality. So while we hope people are engaged with their jobs, are they also being effective and are they moving up in an organization that in a way that supports the overall bench strength? Is the next level of leaders ready to step up and lead the organization into the future? And then as we look at exiting employees, we want to know what are reasons for leaving, what would it take for them to stay in order to get that key piece of feedback. But the bigger organizational learnings are, what are employee frustrations that continue to drive people in different directions? And what are overall market forces? What are those big pull factors that we can start to think about holistically across the company to start to combat, to prevent other people from going in that direction? Now, when we look at this table, these may or may not be the right kinds of questions for your organization, but the point is to illustrate you can get started on this life cycle approach with just a couple of questions on each of the individual and organizational side and start to integrate those touch points across analyses.
Mm-hmm. Clearly there's lots going on and clearly a lot is possible, and it's easy to dream of these possibilities and think about what you want to do. And at the same time, it might have some nightmares that creep in, that you feel you're following behind and that you're not doing everything that you could. And now we've hit sort of the "you got this" part of the webinar. Everybody thinks that everybody else is doing better. We have this kind of conversation on a regular basis, and if we're in a room and we say, who believes that life cycle touch points should be connected, everybody raises their hand. And in fact, that's the result from the survey that we did. Everybody sees that value, but only 1 in 5 currently do. And if we're in a room and we also ask the question, who thinks that everybody else is doing better than they are, everybody raises their hand. So this is sort of the opposite of the whole Lake Wobegon thing, where everybody thinks everybody else is doing better. So don't worry about that. Don't sweat it. What you want to do is do what you can, but know what you're doing. Make sure you focus on the right questions and good questions that are useful for you. And you may not have the best system or the best processes in place, but you can always ask these right questions. So let's drive this home. We're now in the ending part of the life cycle of this webinar, and so we can get to some top takeaways. Number 1, as we've been alluding to all along, start with the right questions and the mechanics will follow. Number 2, especially as represented by the table that Victoria talked about a minute ago, work on the personal and organizational questions. So life cycle surveys often get mired in just asking the personal kinds of things and not trying to focus on organizational interests and needs. Number 3, start with a census survey. Like we did in this webinar, there's a lot of life cycle nuggets that can come from there. And maybe you don't need to blend into other surveys, maybe you do, but at least start there. But as you evolve, you might move to the exit survey and then perhaps onboarding. It can depend on whether you're growing or shrinking or the age or the status of your whole workforce. But as you do this, don't underestimate the challenge of organizational navigation. Privacy, data connections, who owns the databases, and everything like that are all organizational change issues, not so much scientific or data issues, but they will be challenges you need to face. And as you move into that, figure out how to link the surveys together, add actual turnover, add workforce stats, add other kinds of combinations and connections that you can. And certainly the data mechanics will vary widely. Different people may not even do identified surveys, which is fine, which is great. Some people might still have paper surveys. Okay, how do we adapt to that? Some people might have not a lot of email address ability to connect and solicit survey information. That's all fine, but you do what you can, and you make sure you're focused on the right questions, and then all those mechanics will follow. And finally, we want to leave you with one main point that tries to tie a lot of this together. It's the visual takeaway of the life cycle survey point of view that we're trying to convey here. Don't just focus on the individual's perspective and what they may see and experience. That's important, that's good, but also step back and make sure that the information and the insights and the actions that you're driving towards are about managing the system. At any given time, you've got people entering, exiting, doing the loop-de-loops, or whatever it might be in your organization. Try to manage the overall flow, not just the aggregate individual perspectives of what's happening. So, with all of this, I think, Jeff, we have some time for questions, if any have started to come in.
Well, we have a few minutes, so everybody, if you go to the question box on the control panel, you can open that up and submit questions, and we're monitoring it. A few have already come in. But while we're waiting for more to come in, Scott, let me just quickly mention on the next slide, there's an up-and-coming webinar on December 11th, which we're excited about, called Brotopia, using surveys to measure and address risk across workplace culture. We'd invite you all to join us for that webinar. So the first question we have, either Victoria or Scott, my organization does anonymous surveys so it's impossible to link an employee's response from survey to survey. Do you have any recommendations on how we can analyze the data to generate insights?
I can start with an example. Exit surveys back in the day used to do this exactly this way, where if in an exit survey you include some questions that are matched to, let's say, a census survey. So, and I can think of a very specific example where it was a sales force of a fairly involved, technically oriented organization. And we asked questions that mirrored what we knew were drivers of intentions to quit. And so it's like, you know, I got the recognition I needed from my boss. I had the career opportunities and so forth and so on. And so we could take that aggregate sampling of career information or other information that these exiting folks would say, and we could match it to the cohort that they came from in the census survey that came from a while ago. So you would have sales in the census and what did they feel about career and recognition and whatever else we had asked. And then you could look at the aggregate exiters and what they felt. So that's one way to do it. One interesting thing from this particular case study is that over time, and I alluded to this before, they were people that initially they were leaving for other industries, you know, going back to school, and that's actually where the I'm pregnant with twins storyline that I mentioned before came from. Somebody wanted to become a reverend, and so that's great. But over time, it changed, and people were going and exiting to other places, and we found that out through the exit survey. The gaps between the cohort from the census survey and the information from the exit survey on matchable items increased over that time, from not very far apart to increasingly far apart. And also during that time, some of the overall scores for this organization, and particularly the Salesforce cohort, declined. So you can see that even without a lot of mapping one-to-one on identifiable surveys, especially with mapping over time and looking at cohorts, you can find different comparisons to make to launch things together.
Okay. Another question came in. What's the biggest mistake organizations make with onboarding surveys?
With onboarding surveys, good question. I think often with onboarding surveys, the content can be very focused by the experience up to date. So, you know, what was the experience in the hiring process, selecting an offer, and getting started in the first few days, all which can be really valuable pieces of information, but none of them are forward-looking in terms of what is the employee's expectations of, you know, navigating their career, what kinds of support do they expect, or, you know, do they even understand how they're fitting into these broader things. So it does a really good job of evaluating what's happened thus far, but it doesn't give a sense of what these people might need moving forward. And ultimately, people who are managing onboarding programs are looking to help people get up to speed and be successful. So I think they tend to be missing that information that they need looking forward. There's also a piece of action orientation. Is often we ask these questions that are very individual of, you know, what do you need to get your email up to, you know, working or things like that. But there is not a lot that tells you much about how the system works in aggregate. So if we aggregate how people across functions or across geographies are doing with onboarding, there's not really much you can do with that very individual backward-looking focus. Now, if we start to look forward and say, you know, what do people need to be successful, then there are findings that we can look at in groups and start to give, you know, business managers of sort of larger groups that are growing quickly, we can give them some advice from those surveys. But if we keep it too small, it's really tough to make any kind of change or improvement based on it.
Thank you. But one of the things I would add from the standpoint, and I think this applies to multiple of these surveys, onboarding, exit, and some of the others, is there is a tendency to focus on the transaction, and the transaction being, did you know how to fill out form X? Did you get an email? Did you get a computer? Those are all transactional. And I think that's selling the power of the information that you potentially can get from this short. If you broaden out these surveys to go beyond the transactions to the more, some of the more fundamental emotions, or a sense of capability or fulfillment or knowledge, I think it can really add power to these processes. Onboarding, at that point, do they feel that they can have a meaningful career at the organization, as opposed to, yeah, I was able to answer my benefit questionnaire, right? Both are important, right? But they're going to give you different kinds of information. And if you focus on just one or the other, you're not getting the complete picture. I think we have time for just one more question. Do any of your clients currently effectively use a sort of holistic life cycle approach? Is there anybody you can point to and say, yeah, they do it great?
I think so. I think everybody I think nobody might step back and say, yeah, we do it great. But I think as we look around, we see a lot of cases of people who are doing nice, progressive kinds of things. So yeah, it's possible, but I think everybody aspires to more, and I think everybody looks at what they're not doing and what they could be doing, and gets a little frustrated by that. But I do believe it's a larger trend in the survey marketplace to take what used to be big, massive, single shot kinds of census surveys and bust them apart into different kinds of things. We talked about, assembling a landscape of, onboarding and exit surveys to supplement census kinds of information. Other organizations are pulling apart like manager feedback kinds of pieces from their regular survey and creating separate sort of 180 and upwards. So there is a trend towards a broader mosaic of survey projects that a lot of people are managing, and it's hard.
Okay.
It's something that's out there.
Let me jump in. I think we're over time, so I want to be sensitive to when we said we would end. So thank you for that, Scott.
Yep.
And thanks everybody for attending. We look forward to hopefully seeing you at our next webinar in just about a month's time on the Brotopia culture and what does that mean and how do you measure it. As you exit, you're going to get a questionnaire. Please, if you have a moment, fill it out for us. Thanks very much.